Record on this computer. Okay, the red dot is on. So now we're going to start on the first reading from Isaiah chapter 53, 10 to 11, and Caitlin is going to read the first reading for us. Okay. Go ahead.
But it was the Lord's will to crush him with pain by making his life a reparation offering. He shall see his offspring, shall lengthen his days, and the Lord's will shall be accomplished through him. Because of his anguish, he shall see the light. Because of his knowledge, he shall be content. My servant, the just one, shall justify the many. Their iniquity he shall bear.
I'll put in something I meant to put in about liturgy. Good liturgy fosters and nourishes faith. Poor liturgy weakens and destroys faith. When I'm on vacation or attending other liturgies, I thank God every time I break even. Okay, so Caitlin's reading here. What are some of the words, phrases, or images that came to you as she was reading? Sister Mary.
Lord's will was repeated more than once.
Lord's will. More than once. Jane.
Because of his anguish, he shall see the light.
Because of his anguish, he shall see the light. Okay. Mary Ellen.
Justify the many.
Justify the many. Okay. So I'm going to start with an overview of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah of Jerusalem received his call in 742 BC, the year King Uzziah died. That's in chapter 6 of Isaiah. He lived when Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom in 722-21 BC, and he lived through their siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. Most of the material in Isaiah 1 to 39 comes from him. Chapters 24, 25, 26, and 27 are an exception. His poetic oracles were collected and written down by his disciples after his death. The order of the material in the chapters is not chronological. It starts in chapter 1 and 2 with prophetic oracles, and then in chapter 6, we get the story of his call to be a prophet. And this is true of almost all prophetic books. They're not in chronological order. Isaiah of Jerusalem did not sit down and write out the book that we have in his name. His oracles given on various different occasions were assembled by his disciples and put in some kind of order that made sense to them. Second Isaiah is Isaiah 40 to 55. Jerusalem was destroyed. All the nobility were deported to Babylon in 586 BC. The exile ended under Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, who conquered Babylon and began to rule in 538 BC. Second Isaiah, an anonymous prophet, prophesied toward the end of the Babylonian exile, close to 538 BC. Scholars call him Second Isaiah because much of his poetry is has similar themes to that of Isaiah of Jerusalem. And scholars thus posit a difference of 200 years between Isaiah of Jerusalem and the anonymous poet we call second Isaiah. He sees, second Isaiah does, the rising Persian king Cyrus as God's instrument to deliver Israel. And as a matter of fact, second Isaiah calls King Cyrus the Messiah. The only person to be called the Messiah in the Old Testament was this pagan king. Much of his poetry is filled with joy, and much of Handel's Messiah. Every valley will be exalted, okay, and so on. A lot of that comes from second Isaiah. The servant songs are also part of his poetry. More on them in just a minute. And many scholars think that second Isaiah was the world's first monotheist. People, before the Babylonian exile, on their good days, Jews were henotheists. That is, they believed in many gods, but they only worshiped one of them. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, King David, they all believed there were many gods, but their God, the only one they were allowed to worship, is the Lord. It's only in the second Isaiah when we hear all of those, they're just idols. They're the work of human hands. The only God is the Lord. He is the only God. And that's why scholars call him the first monotheist. Third Isaiah, which is Isaiah 56 to 66, this anonymous prophet writes shortly after the return from exile, shortly after 538 BC. And he has to deal with the disappointment and the disillusionment that the joyful prophecies of second Isaiah were not fulfilled immediately. The four servant songs are included in second Isaiah. The first one is in chapter 42, and God's gentle servant brings justice to all. That's my one sentence summary of those verses. The second one's in chapter 49, the servant's mission to Israel and the nations, not just to Israel. In chapter 50, the third psalm, servant song, God's servant is despised and mistreated, but God vindicates him. In the fourth servant song from chapter 52, it's actually 52 verse 13 to chapter 53 verse 12. So it's like 15 verses, I think. The servant suffers a shameful death, yet he sees his offspring. So I suggest, why not read all four poems to prepare for Sunday Mass? You'll appreciate the last one better if you've read through the first three. In the third song, we hear about resistance to the mission of the servant. He's mistreated. In the fourth song, the servant is cut off from the land of the living and buried. In spite of this, the servant will see his offspring. Now, what precisely second Isaiah meant by that is not clear. He is writing several centuries before belief in the resurrection began. So how is this guy who died, how is he going to see his offspring? Maybe he'll be a special case like Elijah, who got taken up to heaven, from where he can look down on his offspring. And there were later Jewish legends that Enoch had been taken up to heaven. So maybe Isaiah, second Isaiah, is thinking of the servant as a special case, but he's not thinking he's going to get raised from the dead. that belief doesn't come for another 300 years. And then some. The identity of the servant. Precisely how 2nd Isaiah understood the identity of the servant is disputed. Sometimes the servant seems to be the collective people of Israel. And he said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." And Reginald Fuller, the Anglican scholar, says, in the rabbinic interpretation, the servant was not the Messiah, the servant was Israel. And however, sometimes the servant appears to be an individual with a ministry to Israel and to the nations. So sometimes the servant is not identified with Israel. It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob. See, notice you are going to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. So here, the servant is an individual. Amazing grace. This is a parable that I often tell. It'll be new to Caitlin and whoever else is new. I am unprepared to give a talk in Dallas, and I receive a phone call. Because of the ice storm, we are canceling your talk. And I say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then I hang up, and then I say, "Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me." I don't have to go over there and make a fool of myself by giving a talk that I'm not prepared for. Now, John Newman was not thinking about me when he wrote Amazing Grace. He was thinking how God saved him from being the captain of a slave ship, okay? I am giving new meaning to the words of John Newton, meaning they did not originally have, and I'm doing this in light of my present experience. I'm saved from embarrassment by the ice storm, and now I make John Newton's words my words in this new situation. Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me. This is what early Christian preachers did. They gave the words of 2nd Isaiah new meaning in light of their experience. What experience? The experience of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, when they read the words of Isaiah, they gave them new meaning that they never would have thought of if they had not experienced the death and resurrection of Jesus. And our own experience of God's victory through suffering makes this story believable to us. The Old Testament never prophesies a suffering Messiah. Often catechetical presentations oversimplify this. And historically, this has resulted in anti-Judaism. It results in a portrayal of the Jewish people who reject the obvious meaning of their own scriptures. And one of the blessings of historical, critical, biblical scholarship that tries to find out what did this mean when the ink was wet is that it undermines this sort of anti-Jewish prejudice. The only way you can have a suffering Messiah is if the same person was the suffering servant and the Messiah. But God could have sent several people to fulfill his promises in the Old Testament. He could have sent a kingly Messiah. He could have sent a priestly Messiah. The people at Qumran were waiting for both of them. He could have sent a prophet like Moses. He could have sent the Son of Man. He could have sent the suffering servant. And in one place, St. Paul in 2 Corinthians, he says, all God's promises find their yes in him. And I say, who would have thought it? Who would have thought that one person would fulfill all these different promises that God had made? And we take it so much for granted that we don't realize it's not astonishing that God fulfilled his promises. What's astonishing is that all these different promises were fulfilled by one person that God sent. So Paul is not interpreting what the old promises meant, all God's promises find their yes in him. He's not interpreting what they meant when the ink was wet. He is giving new meaning to all of them in the light of his experience of the risen Lord that he knew perfectly well had been crucified. He didn't experience the crucifixion, but he knew that Jesus had been crucified, and he had this experience of Jesus as risen Lord. And that's when he decided that all God's promises were fulfilled here. Now I'm going to share something personal. I sent an email to my study buddy, Rabbi David. I said, we're going to read a snippet from the servant psalm, and I'll cut and paste some of my notes. I think you will see how my friendship with you and our study together has helped me to express my Christian faith in a way that is respectful to the Jewish community. I sincerely hope so. And he wrote back, good work, Pat. You are advancing enlightenment and understanding. The thing about being Eved Hashem, the servant of the Lord, is the demanding commitment. He's now talking about Israel as the servant of the Lord, is the demanding commitment, the burden, the bother, the risk, the pain. Deutero-Isaiah introduced this notion to convince the exiles that Yah, a reverent Jewish way to say, they don't say Yahweh, they can say Yah, the Lord, to convince the exiles that Yah still loved them and chose them to be his special people, his servant. My teacher, Sheldon Blank, Alav HaShalom, peace upon him, Jewish equivalent of rest in peace, interpreted Jonah as a metaphor for Yisrael, who did not want to take on the role of redeeming the world. Jonah didn't want to preach to Nineveh, remember? Note that Genesis 12:2 and following has Yah commanding Avram, that's Abram, to be a blessing. He is to be responsible for doing good wherever he goes. This is presumptuous thinking, but readily applies in any cultural context. Then he said, another reason I like what you're doing is that you are basing sermons on the best of critical biblical scholarship rather than what we were taught long ago as homiletics. For me, it was just midrash. Midrash is more puns on scripture and stuff like that. A midrash, how do we know that the Irish people were the first to be evangelized? Because in the gospel we read that he was teaching daily in the temple. That's midrash, okay? Okay, it's not the same as critical scholarship. I made a conscious decision about halfway through my pulpit career to change and do what you are doing. Shalom, David. So we're different faiths, but we're kindred spirits. Words on the liturgical context. We read a larger section of the fourth servant song, all 15 verses, every Good Friday. Today's short passage speaks of the servant giving his life for many. That was the phrase that struck Mary Ellen. In today's gospel, Jesus speaks of the Son of Man giving his life for many. the liturgy proclaims that the servant is the same person as the Son of Man. Who would have thought it unless you were Christian and read the Gospels and knew the prophets? All God's promises find their yes in Jesus. And then, since we're not going to do the psalm today, I'm just going to give a couple of remarks on the psalm response. The response is, and this is for the benefit of lectors, Lord, let your mercy be on us as we place our trust in you. Tip for lectures. In many parishes, the choir takes the psalm, so you don't have to worry about it. However, if you win the psalm in your parish, do not stress the prepositions. Lord, let your mercy be on us as we place our trust in you. No, no, no. Okay. Lord, let your mercy be on us as we place our trust in you. Yes. Okay. You can try to get the main point across by using just the stressed words. Okay. Mercy, us, trust you. That's the main idea. Okay. And try doing that with the prepositions. In, on. No. Last week I mentioned the guideline of stressing the verb. The exception is when the verb is a linking verb, the verb to be. So, Lord, let your mercy be on us. Probably let your mercy be on us. You don't need to stress the be there. And let's see. So I'll take us through a second reading. Let's see, where are we? 29th Sunday. And looking at the first one. So I'll take us through the NRSV if we were Canadians. It was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him, the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish, he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So, questions, comments, observations?
Father Pat, it's Holly.
Yeah, Holly.
I was curious about what Rabbi Klein meant by this is presumptuous thinking, but readily applies in any cultural context. And so it's about the servant, or was it about using Jonah as a metaphor for Israel? So I wasn't really sure what he meant by this.
He's talking about Jews as the servant of God, and that it's our duty wherever we go to make God visible, to make God's presence visible. That's what's presumptuous, he says.
Okay.
It's like if we Catholics would say, well, here we're only 3% in the Bible Belt, but it's our duty to make the society aware of our values, even though we're only 3%. That's a little bit presumptuous.
Okay.
But We stand up for what we believe. So that was his point.
Okay,
and-
great. That makes sense then.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks for the question. Any others before we take our break? Okay, well, let's break then, and I'll stop the recording.